Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Chop It Up. We got a good one for you guys today as we're going to be diving into week 11 of college football. This week brought two upsets within the top four, a couple big time ranked matchups and elimination games. But before we get into all that, I just want to take a minute to promote our channel and what we're doing here at Chop It Up Sports. For those of you that want to catch our full episodes, you can catch the visual or the video on YouTube, or you can catch our full audio episodes on Spotify. So it's YouTube and Spotify for the full episodes. For those of you that are just looking to see some quick clips or just don't have as much time in your busy week to catch a full episode, we're putting up little snippets on Instagram and TikTok, so be sure to go check us out on those platforms as well. If you're looking for predictions or clips from last weekend's episode, you can find those on Instagram or TikTok. So once again, full episodes, YouTube, Spotify, quick clips and snippets, Instagram, TikTok. So please be sure to go check us out there and drop a comment or just a recommendation on what you want to see here. We're open to all ideas. If you want to come on the podcast, DM me or just email me or whatever, and we'll see if we can work something out. We'd love to get more guests on our show here. As you can see, a little bit of a different setup. Didn't get into the studio this weekend, so we are here in the library recording our episode today. And that's just how we do it as a college student here. Just got to survive one day at a time. So let's get into it here. I don't want to waste any more of our time. This weekend we had two teams in the top four. Just said that a few moments ago. Let's start it off in the SEC. Number 3 Georgia goes on the road to Oxford, Mississippi, and gets throttled by Ole Miss. This is a game that I really didn't see coming. I thought Georgia had really locked in on the second half of the season. This is a tough stretch for the Bulldogs, but I thought they were prepared for it, and I thought Kirby Smart was going to have this team ready to go. And I just think they got caught lacking a little bit. I think this Ole Miss defense is better than people give them credit for. We're going to get into that defense in a little bit, but a lot of this credit has to go to Lane Kiffin and his coaching staff. Just the way they were able to bring in talent this year and go to the portal and build their defensive line and build their linebacker core and their secondary. This was the issue that we'd seen with Ole Miss in bigger games in the last couple of seasons. Is they had an offense that could put up points, but their defense really just couldn't find a way to make plays and get stops when it mattered most, and they would just get their doors blown off in big games, and that's not what happened this weekend. We saw an Ole Miss team that played fundamental defense. They limited their penalties. Was the offense great by any means? No, not at all. But this defense held Georgia to 10 points. This is a Georgia offense that went into Texas and put up 30 on the Longhorns. Carson Beck, supposed to be a top pick in the draft, first round pick at worst, and he did not look well in this game. I just think that he's not as good as people expected him to be. So big credit to this Rebels defense. They came in here, they took care of business. They had that home crowd behind them, which I think helped them out a lot. And almost going forward, they just put themselves in the thick of it. Before this week, I don't think a ton of people were taking Ole Miss seriously. I think they're pretty similar to Penn State in the Big Ten, whereas Ole Miss is just in a tougher conference where, yeah, they're going to beat up on mid-tier to low-quality opponents, but when it's time to win a big game and knock down a top 5 opponent, a top 10 opponent, they've just never been able to get that done. But this weekend was different. I think, as we break down this game, you're going to really see that Ole Miss, if they're able to get into the college football playoff, they can be a sleeper. And I don't really think there's going to be a ton of teams that are going to get into that college football playoff, especially if you're a team that wins their conference and gets a bye. I don't think Ole Miss is really a team that you want to see, especially at a neutral site. Looking at this game, this was another poor performance from Carson Beck. He threw for a little over 100 yards. He had no touchdowns and 1 interception. The last couple of weeks, he's just been in a real slump. And looking at this, just in the last couple of games, and even on the broadcast, they're talking about how he's just been so focused on trying to force the ball into certain situations and trying to be the man and really just doing more than what he's asked. And I think that's really hurt Carson Beck in terms of not only his draft stock, but just the way in which he plays. You can tell when he's on the field, he's trying to force things a little too much. He's trying to make the perfect pass rather than making the smart play. And to me, that's hurt this Georgia team now, having 2 losses on the season, when realistically they probably should have won both the games that they lost this year. And I just think a lot of this has to fall on Carson Beck. I don't know if it's the slump or if he's not playing well, if the offense is maybe different from what he has expected it to be. But I just think that this Georgia team is only going to go as far as Carson Beck and their defense takes them. And so far, Carson Beck has been what's holding them back. When you look at the last couple games, he's turned the ball over a ton. He hasn't played clean football. And I think we all saw that clip at the end of the game where he's laughing on the sidelines as Georgia's down 2 possessions and the clock's running out. If I'm a Georgia fan, I am pissed. That is not what I want to see from a quarterback, especially someone that's supposed to be an NFL prospect and the leader of what could potentially be a national championship team. And he's laughing on the sidelines as you just went on the road and got your butts handed to you by a team that you probably should have beat. I'm not happy if I'm a coach. I'm not happy if I'm a fan. Obviously, I don't know the context of the situation. There could be a lot more behind it than what we know. But that's just not a good look if you're Georgia. A lot of people expect you to be the conference champ, if not the national champions. And to already have 2 losses 10 games into the season, that's just not a good look. We're going to get into a little bit later in this episode about how Georgia can keep their playoff dreams alive. But it's going to be tougher than I think Bulldog fans were expecting. And I think Ole Miss might have been a little bit better than they were getting credit for. Jackson Dart wasn't great in this game. He was fighting through some injuries, so I want to give him credit where credit is due. That's tough to get knocked down earlier in the game. He went back into the trainer's room. The backup had to come in for a little bit. And for a minute, you're thinking, okay, here we go. Ole Miss, it's a big game. Quarterback gets hurt in the first quarter. You can kind of just see the spiral starting to happen. But Jackson Dart comes back. He plays a tough game. Was he as good as he normally is? No. He had 199 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. So not great. But that's not exactly all on him, especially with the injury. As a quarterback, you never really know how much an injury is going to affect your play. And so I think for him to come in and just play his brand of football was really important, and ultimately is what helped them win. Obviously, the defense was great, but I think Jackson Dart's toughness and his resilience was really a symbol and a credit to this Ole Miss team that they're ready to come in here at home and defend their turf and show that they are a legitimate college football playoff contender. And I think they might be. Looking forward, they don't really have any tough games to close out their season. Looking at their resume, obviously they have the 2 losses to LSU and Kentucky, but I think this win over Georgia is going to propel them at least into the top 10. We'll see what the committee says Tuesday night about where they rank. But I think Ole Miss might have just thrown themselves into the mix after a lot of people probably counted them out. I definitely didn't expect them to win this game. And now when you look at both these teams, they're kind of in the mix. They don't necessarily control their own destiny. So it's going to be really interesting to see where both teams go from here following the big win in Oxford for the Rebels. Moving on to our second upset of the week. Number 4, Miami goes on the road to Atlanta and falls to Georgia Tech in what was a defensive clinic from the Yellow Jackets. Similar to the Ole Miss game, I felt like Georgia Tech defensively just caused havoc, which is interesting because when you look at this box score, and specifically Miami, it's a pretty typical game. Cam Ward, 350 yards, 3 touchdowns. They didn't really turn the ball over until the very last possession of the game. But I think if you were to watch the game and you were to see live what was happening, this Georgia Tech defense was just pesky and they got stops when they needed it most. Looking at the second quarter, which has been a big part of Miami's offense, is being able to put points up heading into the half. They were scoreless, and Georgia Tech just had this steady attack. It wasn't sexy, it wasn't fun to watch, but they just shoved it down Miami's throat, and Miami had no response for that. Looking at this offense, Haynes King, the starting quarterback, he's dealt with some injury issues, but he was still able to be productive on his legs. He had more rushing yards than he had passing yards, and he's a quarterback. When you look at the stats, he had 20 carries for 93 yards, leading the Yellow Jackets in carries and rushing yards on the day. If you're Miami and you're Mario Cristobal, that's a bad look. That's not something you want to see, especially if you're Mario Cristobal, who is a guy that is supposed to be building this team off of being tough in the trenches and having a strong offensive and defensive line. For you to go into Georgia Tech and for them to hang up 271 yards on the ground on what is supposed to be a top 5 team in the nation, that's not a good sign. And for me, that really just plays into the point that I've been trying to make all year long about how weak the ACC has been, whether it's Miami, whether it's Clemson, SMU, the jury is still out on them. The one bad loss to BYU, we'll see how they finish out their season. I think we still are going to see Miami one way or another make it into this college football playoff, most likely being the champion of the ACC. I just don't see any other teams being a real threat. I know SMU looks poised to play spoiler for the Hurricanes. I still think Miami's going to be able to put up a lot of points on the board to close out this year and ultimately win the ACC. But this just shows to me that they're not a true contender. If you're giving up nearly 300 yards on the ground to a team like Georgia Tech, how do you think that's going to fare against an Oregon, an Ohio State, or even teams in the SEC like a Texas or an Alabama if they get in? Just not a great look for the Canes, and it really just plays right into this idea that the ACC is pathetic, which is what I've been saying all year long. So those are our upsets for the week. Looking at the SEC, this is really a segment that I want to get into and spend some time on, just because there's so many scenarios that can happen. When you go look up the SEC standings, there's about 6 or 7 teams within that top 15 range that could seriously make it into this college football playoff. The hard part is that there's only really 7 at-large bids when you have 4 conference champions and then the 12th spot being reserved for the non-Power 4 conference champion. So you have 7 at-large bids, and with how many good teams there are in the Big Ten and the SEC, there's really only so many spots that can be taken up. I would not be shocked if we see all 7 spots get reserved by SEC and Big Ten schools. In my opinion, there's about 2 to 3 Big Ten schools that will take up those spots. Oregon / Ohio State, whichever one loses the Big Ten championship game, Indiana, and Penn State. So I think you're going to have 3 Big Ten teams legitimately that are going to be in the college football playoff outside of whoever the conference champion is. So that leaves 4 spots for SEC schools plus the conference champion. So we're going to preview what happened this weekend and then just look into where these teams rank, what the remaining schedule looks like, and what their key wins and losses are. So we had Georgia lose to Ole Miss. We already talked about that. Georgia looks to be trending in the wrong direction, which is not good considering the fact that they have Tennessee coming to town next weekend. Alabama, a team we haven't talked about in this episode, walked into Death Valley and killed LSU on the road in a hostile environment. Big win for the Tide there. Jalen Milroe looked great. LSU had no answer for Jalen Milroe's legs in his run game. And Alabama just continues to ride the pendulum back and forth between contender and pretender in this year of college football. So where do things shake out? We're going to go team by team, and I'm just going to tell you what these teams rank, how legit I think they are, what their key losses are, what their key wins are, and then who they have remaining on their schedule that could be a legitimate threat. Starting it off with Tennessee, they're 8-1. That loss comes to Arkansas. That's a really bad loss. I don't think the committee's going to love that one. However, since then, they've looked resilient and they look like they can be a true threat in the SEC. They do have the win over Bama that they picked up at home. That is going to be important, especially considering how strong Alabama has looked since that loss to Tennessee. However, the Vols do go to Georgia next week in Athens to take on the Bulldogs. That's going to be a close one. It's really hard to determine how that one's going to look. Kirby Smart and Georgia coming back home after a bad loss to Ole Miss. I have a hard time believing Georgia's not going to respond well to that one. But you never know, especially with how inconsistent Carson Beck has been. I could see a world where the Vols come into town, upset the Bulldogs, and knock them out of playoff contention. In my opinion, this is an elimination game. I think if Tennessee loses, that puts them at 8-2 with a loss to Georgia. And that loss to Arkansas is just going to come back to bite them. If you're going to be a college football playoff contender, you just can't afford those bad losses to poor teams at the bottom of your conference, especially on the road. Like, that's going to hurt you, and the committee's not going to like that at all. So we'll see where Tennessee ranks. Right now, I think they're in a good spot, but this upcoming Saturday is really going to make or break their season, in my opinion. Next up, we have Texas A&M. Who would have thought that the Aggies would have been in this conversation after week 1 getting beat down at home by Notre Dame? Texas A&M sits at 7-2, both losses coming to Notre Dame and South Carolina. Similar to Tennessee, having an ugly loss to a bad team. South Carolina, I wouldn't say they're a bad team, but they've been up and down a lot this year. And similar to Texas A&M, right when you think they're a legitimate contender, they beat Missouri, they beat LSU at home, then they drop a game to South Carolina. Pretty inconsistent. I talked about this a couple episodes back with my friend Hunter. I just don't think that Texas A&M is a contender. And based on the committee's rankings, I don't think the committee sees them as a true contender either, as they put them outside of that top 12. However, Texas A&M closes their season out with Texas at home in Kyle Field. I think that'll be a tough one for Texas to win, but ultimately I think the Longhorns will have enough to get it done. Just based off the inconsistency of A&M, especially on the offensive side of things, I don't love what I see there. So does Texas A&M have a chance? Yes. Do I think they will make it in? No. And that's all I have to say about the Aggies. Moving on to Texas. I think Texas is going to win the SEC outright. I think they win out their regular schedule, and then I think they win the conference championship against who knows at this point. But looking at their resume, they have that ugly loss to Georgia at home. I think Georgia might have just caught them on an off night. Quinn Ewers didn't look great. Arch Manning struggled when he was in the game as well. I think Texas will learn from their mistakes. I think if they were to match up with Georgia or Alabama or a team like that now, they'd probably beat up on them pretty handedly, especially considering where Georgia is at this point in the season. Like I just mentioned with Texas A&M, we have that matchup at the end of the season. So if Texas is able to go into College Station and pick up that win, that's a big win for them. That builds their resume, ultimately propels them into the SEC championship game, more than likely. And I just think that's a good spot for Texas to be. I'm confident in this team. I've been confident in them all year. I like how they responded to the Georgia loss. So give me Texas to make this college football playoff and most likely win the SEC championship game. Now, speaking of Texas's one loss, let's look at Georgia for a minute. They're 7-2. Their loss is coming to Alabama and Ole Miss, obviously yesterday or Saturday night for those watching during the work week. They've been up and down. The Georgia game was really weird. They got beat down in that first half and then almost won it at the end in the fourth quarter, led up a couple big plays to Jalen Milroe and Ryan Williams, and ultimately they just couldn't get the win there. But since then, they had looked really good. They were ranked in the top 5. They looked like they were a true contender. They walk into Austin and they beat Texas at home. And then they turn around and they come and lose to Ole Miss in a game that a lot of people had Georgia favored. I had Georgia favored. And they just couldn't get it done. They haven't looked great. This doesn't look like it's going to be the same old Georgia that we've seen in years past. However, this Tennessee game that we've been talking about next Saturday, game day is going to be there. It's going to be a hard place to win, especially if you're Tennessee walking into that stadium. I think Georgia plays really well. I think they will have enough to get it done, but it is really going to depend on whether Carson Beck shows up to play or not. If he doesn't, Georgia's playoff hopes are definitely on the line. But if Georgia shows up to play and they can beat Tennessee and they can win out their schedule, not only will they have a chance to get into the SEC championship game, but they also have a chance to get themselves into the college football playoff because that's a strong resume. They probably have the best losses out of anyone in the SEC between Alabama and Mississippi. Those are both borderline top 10 teams. And then Tennessee obviously being at the top of the ranks in the conference right now. If they're able to pull it off at home next weekend, I think Georgia is in a good spot. If they don't get into the SEC championship game, it's going to be really weird to see what the committee does because you have 2 losses that, obviously it's better to have wins and losses. But if you're going to lose 2 games, Bama and Mississippi were the teams to lose those 2 games. Those are probably the best 2 teams on their schedule outside of Tennessee and Texas. So 2 key wins, 2 key losses. Are those going to be able to balance each other out? We will see next weekend. I think the eye test is definitely going to play a role here. If Georgia dominates Tennessee, I think that favors them, and I think they're able to see themselves into an at-large bid. If they squeak by, I think that still probably does enough, but it's really going to be whether the committee likes those losses to Bama and Mississippi, and if their wins against Texas and, let's say, Tennessee are going to be enough to get them a playoff spot. So we'll see with Georgia. Next up, we just got the team that beat Georgia, Ole Miss. Outside of Texas A&M, I think they probably have the longest shot to get in despite the win, just because of their losses. They're 8-2, a loss to Kentucky earlier in the season. That definitely didn't look good. And then a loss to LSU in Death Valley a couple weeks ago. They do have the win over Georgia, like I just mentioned. But I just think when you look at Kentucky and LSU, those probably aren't great losses considering that LSU just got throttled at home against Bama. And obviously Kentucky isn't a very good team either. So the resume here, I think it favors, teams like Bama, Georgia, Tennessee, if they end up being a wild card. I think it favors those schools more just because of the wins they have, and they probably have better losses. Whereas Ole Miss probably has the lesser of those losses. Yes, LSU is a good team, but they're obviously not a playoff contender considering what we saw Saturday night in Death Valley. And then obviously that loss to Kentucky, I think, is really going to come back to bite the Rebels. But they have a chance. If things go their way, if the teams in front of them lose, you never know, and that is why we love college football. Last but certainly not least, Alabama. I know this has been long. I hope you're tracking along. This is the last team in the SEC. Bama, 7-2. They have the losses to Tennessee and Vandy, both on the road. They do have the win over Georgia earlier in the year. Looked like they were going to blow the doors off of the Bulldogs, and then Georgia mounted a massive comeback. However, Alabama is still able to get the win there. When you look at Alabama, they don't really have any tough games left. I think they play Mercer next weekend, and then they close it out with the Iron Bowl a couple weeks out. So I think Bama can win out. Whether they get into the playoff or not, I think really depends on how Georgia performs. I think if I'm an Alabama fan, I'm rooting for Georgia to win and everyone else to lose, especially when you look at it. Tennessee, that would be 2 losses. However, Tennessee does have the tiebreaker on Alabama, but you beat Georgia. So the better Georgia does, the more likely it probably favors the Tide. However, they're going to need a lot to fall their way as well. But this win over Death Valley, which we really haven't, the win over LSU in Death Valley, we really haven't talked about it a lot, but I do think this favors Alabama just because they look so dominant, and the fact that they're able to show the resilience to go on the road, hostile environment, and really dominate that game from start to finish. It really felt like LSU never had a chance after the first couple possessions. I think it shows that Bama can contend with just about everyone. Yes, they lost to Tennessee in a close game, and yeah, they lost to Vandy in kind of a slump before Vandy was really the team that people knew that they were. I think Alabama is still in contention, which is just so crazy to say that, because a couple weeks ago, it looked like this team was completely out of it following the loss to Tennessee. Their offense was abysmal. Jalen Milroe was really struggling. I think Kalen DeBoer has really helped his team rally. They're going to close out I think they're going to close out the season strong, in my opinion. So look for the Tide to sneak into the college football playoff spot. We will have to tell how things shake out here in a couple weeks. Now, I just told you all these different scenarios, who these teams play, who I think they're going to beat, how their losses affect them, etc., etc. This is how I think it's going to play out. And these are just my predictions of how the SEC is going to shake out and who is going to get in to the at-large bids in the college football playoff. The conference champion coming out of the Southeastern Conference, I have Texas. I think Texas is the most complete team in this conference from head to toe. I like the experience on both sides of the ball. Quinn Ewers and Isaiah Bond, I really like that connection, and just what I've seen from Steve Sarkisian's offense for the majority of the season outside of the Georgia game, they've been really good. I think this defense has stepped up major from the last couple seasons. And I just think Texas is the most complete team at this point, which is funny because 2 days ago, if you would have told me who the most complete team was, I would have told you Georgia. But then this is how things shake out. One team loses and they look terrible, and it's just the next team up. And right now that is Texas. So give me the Horns to win the SEC outright. My at-large bids, like I talked about earlier, it's not going to be easy. But the way I see it, with these 7 bids, I think we're going to have 3 Big Ten teams, and I think we're going to have 4 SEC teams. My 3 Big Ten teams I predict will be Oregon, Penn State, Indiana. I think all 3 of those get in. I think Ohio State wins the Big Ten despite the loss that they suffered to Oregon a couple weeks ago. But my at-large bids here in the SEC, first up I have Tennessee. I think win or lose next weekend, Tennessee is going to be able to have a resume that they can present to the committee that shows, hey, we can compete with these good teams. We can play at the national level. Yes, our quarterback is young, but we can compete with anyone. They have the win over Bama. If they beat Georgia, that pretty much seals the deal for them being in, even if they don't win the conference championship, because at that point they would have 2 losses, one of those being to most likely Texas. And yes, I know they have the bad loss to Arkansas, but if that's your only loss of the season outside of your conference championship, that's a hard resume to turn down. So give me the balls to squeak in to a college football playoff spot. Next up, I have Alabama. I think Alabama is going to win out. They don't really have any tough games to close out their schedule. The work is pretty much behind them. The Vanderbilt and Tennessee loss is going to hurt. However, I think if Tennessee is able to beat Georgia, I think that helps Tennessee. I think if Georgia is able to beat Tennessee, I think that probably helps Bama a little bit, just in the sense that Bama has that win over the Bulldogs. Therefore, if Georgia plays at a high level to close out the season, that probably makes Alabama look a little bit better. And if the Tide continue to dominate, I do think that they're going to be able to put themselves in a playoff spot. It's not going to be easy. They definitely don't control their own destiny. They need a lot to happen. This Bama-Tennessee game, this Georgia-Tennessee game is going to have massive implications on the Tide just because of the fact that they lost to one team and beat the other. So I think it's a weird spot because if Tennessee wins, it knocks out Georgia, which pretty much gets them out of the way for Alabama. But then if Georgia wins, you have to consider the fact that Bama beat Georgia earlier in the season. And it's just going to be tough for this committee to decide what they're going to do with the Tide. But I think they'll find a way to get in, so don't be surprised. Next up, I have Ole Miss. I think this weekend really showed that Ole Miss can compete on both sides of the ball. Defensively, they look really good against a Georgia team that is known to pretty much out-physical and out-tough teams. And Ole Miss just looked like they were the better team on Saturday. Defensively, they were all over the place, flying to the ball. They caused, I think there was 3 turnovers, 1 interception and 2 fumbles against Georgia. And I just think that this team is reckless. I think that Jackson Dart, once he gets healthy, is going to expand this offense even more than what we've seen this season. I think Ole Miss finds a way to get in. I think this Georgia win really helps them. And don't be surprised if the Rebels get in to the college football playoff. Last but certainly not least, I have Georgia finding a way to get into the playoffs. Now listen, I know if Georgia loses this game, that's going to have 3 losses, and statistically that probably doesn't play out in their favor. But if we're simply just talking about who are the 12 best teams, we know we're going to have our 4 conference champions. We know we're going to have our number 12 seed, whether it's Boise State or Army or someone else comes out of the woodworks and takes that spot. But I would much rather watch 3-loss Georgia than watch 1-loss SMU or an Army team or Clemson or someone out of a weaker conference who hasn't really been tested but only has 1 to 2 losses over a Georgia team who maybe isn't the national championship contender that we thought they were, but is still a legitimate team that just hasn't found a way to win the big games this season due to how tough their schedule was. I think Georgia still finds a way into this playoff. I think they're going to play well at home next week. Don't be surprised if they knock off Tennessee. And if they beat Tennessee, obviously that helps them out big time. It kind of clears the way for them to solidify themselves in the playoff. Now, in terms of the conference championship, it's going to be tough. In my opinion, it'll probably be Texas and then the winner of this Tennessee-Georgia game. So despite the loss, there is a way where Georgia sees themselves into the SEC championship game. But similar to every other team we've talked about, they don't necessarily control their own destiny. They still have to have teams in front of them lose, like Tennessee, like Alabama, like Ole Miss, who will most likely jump them when the results come out on Tuesday for the top 12. It's just going to be interesting to see. But yes, I have 5 SEC teams in my top 12. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. But don't be surprised to see an SEC takeover in the college football playoff. That is going to wrap it up for this episode of Chop It Up. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Be sure to go check us out on YouTube and Spotify for the full episodes. If you can't get the time to watch our full podcasts, be sure to go check out our clips on on Instagram and TikTok. That is going to do it for today. Thank you guys for listening, and we will catch you guys on the next one.